The Hollow Oak was the kind of place that had seen generations pass through its doors, worn wood floors, hand-carved stools, and a smell of old smoke soaked into every beam. On stormy nights, it came alive like an old ghost shaking off the cold. Locals gathered there not for excitement, but for comfort. That night in early October, the wind outside roared like it had something to prove. Thick fog rolled in over the hills and pressed against the windows like a curious hand. Inside, the pub glowed with the familiar warmth of clinking glasses and laughter rising above the hum of an old radio. Daniel Price, the bartender, moved effortlessly behind the counter, towel slung over one shoulder, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a grin that could disarm even the most sour-faced regular. At 29, Daniel was a familiar face in the area. He wasn't born in that town, but over the past 5 years, he had made the pub his own. Locals said he had a gift. He remembered names, knew when to talk and when to just listen. For some, he was the only person they spoke to all week. He poured drinks with flair, cracked jokes that were better than they needed to be, and knew every customer's story without needing to pry. That night, he seemed no different. He filled glasses, checked the weather on the pub's tiny wall-mounted TV, and teased old Mr. Halvorsen about drinking Storm whiskey. Around 11:40 p.m., after pouring a final round for the last few patrons, Daniel mentioned stepping out back for a smoke. It was routine. He always took 5 minutes out by the dumpster, lit a cigarette, looked up at the stars, and let the noise fade away. He grabbed a pack from under the register but left his phone and wallet. "Be right back," he said. No one thought twice. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The dishwasher asked where he'd gone. The cook checked the storeroom. The back door stood slightly ajar, swinging faintly in the wind. Outside, the alley was empty. Rain had begun falling in steady sheets, but no footprints were visible in the gravel. Daniel's jacket still hung on the peg. His car keys were untouched. The pub grew quieter as realization sank in. Daniel wasn't coming back inside. He never did. By dawn the next morning, the Hollow Oak stood strangely quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the pale gray sky. Dew clung to the bar's wooden sign, and a damp wind rustled the trees at the edge of the property. Inside, the place looked just as Daniel had left it, glasses rinsed and stacked, chairs pushed in, the register locked. But his absence had settled heavily over everything, like a curtain pulled across a stage mid-performance. When Daniel didn't return home and failed to respond to calls or messages, concern turned to alarm. His roommate reported him missing just after 9 a.m., and by lunchtime, police had cordoned off the pub's rear alley. Sheriff Evan Marnell arrived on site personally. He'd known Daniel in passing, a friendly guy, never trouble, someone you didn't forget easily. That made the whole thing worse. The investigation started fast. Officers canvassed the property, combed the thick woods behind the building, and questioned every patron from the night before. The last confirmed sighting was from a cook who saw Daniel head out the back door with a cigarette in hand. No one saw him leave the alley. No cars were heard pulling up. No shouts. No sign of a struggle. It was like he'd vanished into mist. Bloodhounds were brought in by the afternoon. At first, the dogs picked up Daniel's scent near the back steps, following it a few hundred feet into the woods, then abruptly lost it at a gravel turnout where a narrow logging path met the tree line. No tire tracks. No footprints. Just a clean cutoff. As if he'd been lifted from the earth. They pulled CCTV from nearby traffic cameras, but the Hollow Oak sat just beyond the system's reach. The pub's own security system, old and patched together by a local handyman, offered nothing. The cameras inside had caught Daniel chatting with patrons, pouring drinks, smiling. The footage outside, however, froze at exactly 11:57 p.m. The timestamp blinked, and the screen glitched into gray static for 6 minutes. When it resumed, Daniel was gone. The alley was empty. No one entered or exited. Not even a cat. The community rallied. Volunteers joined the search, forming lines across the surrounding woods. They checked ditches, fields, riverbanks. Dive teams swept nearby ponds. Nothing. No phone signal. No body. No clothing. As if the rain had washed every trace of him from the earth. Rumors began immediately. Maybe Daniel had run off, though no one believed it. He had no debts, no enemies, and no reason to disappear. He'd just put down a deposit for a trip to Ireland with his brother. He was planning a surprise party for a friend next week. People don't vanish in the middle of their lives for no reason. But Daniel Price had. And with each passing hour, the silence surrounding his disappearance deepened, not loud or violent, but hollow and absolute, like a door closing quietly behind someone who would never return. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock of Daniel Price's disappearance gave way to speculation, rumor, and something else harder to name, an unease that settled over the town like a low fog that never quite burned off. The police investigation went cold quickly. With no new evidence, no suspects, and no leads, the case was quietly shuffled into the unsolved file. But the Hollow Oak pub never went back to normal. People noticed the difference immediately. The regulars still came at first, if only out of habit, but the energy inside had changed. The laughter was thinner, conversations shorter. What used to be a place of warmth and familiarity now felt colder, like something was missing, and not just the man behind the bar. It started with small things. The jukebox would skip randomly, landing on songs no one remembered selecting, low, moody country ballads that made the walls seem closer. Glasses fell from shelves for no reason. One bartender claimed she'd seen the cooler door swing open on its own, even when it was latched. Another swore she heard footsteps behind her in the kitchen late one night, only to find the room completely empty. And then there were the stories about the stranger. Several customers mentioned him, a tall man in a dark coat and broad hat who had been seen at the pub more than once in the weeks leading up to Daniel's disappearance. No one remembered him speaking. He'd sit alone at the far corner of the bar, always drinking the same thing, neat whiskey, untouched. One waitress said his eyes seemed too dark, like they didn't reflect the light right. Others said he gave them the kind of chill you don't feel from the weather. The strangest part, when they reviewed the pub's indoor camera footage to look for this man, he never appeared. He was described by multiple witnesses, yet the tapes showed nothing but empty chairs where he should have been sitting. The pub owner, Alan Prentice, dismissed the stories publicly. He told reporters the rumors were born from grief and small-town boredom. But privately, he stopped staying late. Started leaving the lights on after hours. One night, long after closing, he heard someone whisper his name from the alley behind the building. When he rushed out to confront the prankster, he found no one. Just the same gravel path Daniel had disappeared down, soaked again by another sudden rain. By the third month, customers stopped coming entirely after sundown. Delivery drivers requested daytime drop-offs. The staff, once a lively group, dwindled to two part-timers and Alan himself. Eventually, Alan put up a sign saying the Hollow Oak would close, temporarily for renovations. It never reopened. Whatever happened to Daniel Price that night didn't just take a person, it left something behind in the silence. Something people could feel, even if they couldn't explain it. And over time, that feeling sank into the walls of the pub like smoke. Something wrong. Something watching. Something waiting. The Hollow Oak stood silent and forgotten by the time the fourth winter rolled around, its shutters nailed closed, its sign hanging crooked and worn. The once bustling pub that had echoed with laughter and music now looked like a ghost frozen in time. Moss crept up the sides of the old stone foundation, and weeds cracked through the gravel of the back alley where Daniel Price had last been seen. Most people in the area didn't talk about the place anymore, not directly. They passed it with downcast eyes or crossed to the other side of the road without thinking. Even in daylight, the old pub seemed to radiate something heavy, something wrong. After 2 years of standing empty, Alan Prentice, the pub's owner, attempted to reopen. He had a new business partner, a marketing idea to rebrand the Hollow Oak as a boutique gastropub, and enough money to fix the place up. He hired contractors, replaced fixtures, scrubbed down every surface. But something was always off. Power outages struck randomly, even after the wiring had been replaced. Strange knocking sounds came from behind the cellar door at night, despite the room being locked and empty. And tools went missing or were found in odd places, often returned, but subtly altered, as if someone else had been using them. Then came the fire. It started just before dawn on a Thursday, in the back storage room, the same section where Daniel had reportedly stepped out for his final smoke. The fire was small, controlled quickly, but what puzzled the fire marshal was the source. A series of old liquor boxes that had never been restocked since the bar closed, soaked in a strange oily substance no one could identify. No matches, no faulty wiring, no storm damage. The fire didn't spread. It was almost as if it had been meant to signal something. Alan never tried to reopen again. Within a week, he sold the property at a loss to a distant landholder who had no plans for it. The contractors stopped answering his calls. One of them, a normally stoic man in his 40s, confessed to waking up at 3 a.m. every night during the renovations, drenched in sweat, hearing whispers in a voice he swore he recognized but couldn't place. After leaving the job, the dreams stopped. People in town began calling the Hollow Oak hollow for real, not just abandoned, but emptied of something vital. Or maybe filled with something that had taken Daniel's place. Kids dared each other to go near the building at night, but few got closer than the property line. One teen who claimed to have gotten inside posted online about hearing the words, "Not yet," whispered directly into his ear, though no one else had been there. His post went viral briefly, then his account was deleted. He refused to talk about it after. By year 6, the building had nearly collapsed in on itself. Ivy choked the windows. The roof caved in during a storm. It should have been forgotten, another casualty of time in a fading rural town. But then came the call from the demolition crew clearing the roadside motel 10 miles down the highway. They had found something. And suddenly, the Hollow Oak wasn't forgotten anymore. Room 3B at the Blue Pine Motel had been locked for over 3 years. The Blue Pine itself sat quietly off the main road, just a 10-minute drive from the Hollow Oak. Once a popular stop for traveling truckers and lost tourists, it had slowly decayed into a relic of another era. Sun-bleached signage, buzzing light fixtures, and a staff reduced to a single night manager who spent most of his time asleep behind the desk. Most of the rooms were either long-term rentals for people with nowhere else to go, or sealed off entirely. Room 3B was one of the latter. After a tenant left suddenly in 2017, the door had been padlocked shut. No one remembered exactly why. The ledger had been misplaced, and the manager never got around to reopening it. Until now. The motel was being cleared for demolition in the summer of 2023. The new property owner intended to bulldoze the entire structure to make way for a chain gas station. A cleanup crew arrived to remove any remaining furnishings, scrap metal, or materials worth salvaging before the machines came in. That's when 2 workers, prying open room 3B, found the door latch had been locked from the inside. Not just closed, bolted. They had to force it open. The room was dark. The windows had been blacked out with heavy curtains and layers of duct tape. A single chair sat facing the wall. The air was stale, thick with dust and something else, mildew, maybe, or old sweat. The bed was bare except for a single sheet and a foam pillow compressed in the center, as if someone had slept in that exact spot night after night, unmoving. But what chilled them wasn't the neglect. It was what they found under the bed. A sealed manila envelope marked in neat handwriting. For whoever still remembers me. Inside was a driver's license. Daniel Price's driver's license, cracked down the middle but undeniably real. Alongside it was a photograph, printed on glossy paper, slightly warped from time. It showed a man standing in front of a mirror. Daniel. Older. Gaunt. Hollow-eyed. He looked directly at the camera, face pale and unshaven. He wore clothes no one recognized, a gray hoodie, unfamiliar jeans. But it was what stood behind him in the mirror's reflection that froze the cleanup crew in place. A tall figure. Shadowed. Faceless. Barely visible, but unmistakably there. The figure loomed in the corner of the reflection, so faint it might have been missed entirely if not for the angles matching too perfectly. It was something wrong, out of scale, out of place. The mirror showed it, but the photo's foreground did not. There was no mirror in room 3B. The crew called the site manager, who immediately contacted the police. Within hours, the room was sealed off and reopened as part of a renewed investigation. For the first time in 6 years, Daniel Price's case file was marked active. Fingerprints were taken. The photo was analyzed. Experts confirmed the image had not been digitally altered. The camera model used to take it, noted in the photo's embedded metadata, was released in 2019, 4 years after Daniel had disappeared. But Daniel wasn't just missing anymore. This photo proved he had been alive, at least recently. And he had been here. But if that was true, where was he now? And what was standing behind him when the shutter clicked? The photograph stunned everyone, investigators, locals, even Daniel's own family, who had long given up hope of ever knowing what happened to him. Yet here he was, unmistakable even through the hollowness in his face, captured in a dim mirror in room 3B. The lines under his eyes were deeper, his beard unkempt, and his body thinner, but the sadness in his expression made it clear, Daniel had not left willingly. The strange figure behind him, though barely visible, couldn't be dismissed. Several detectives insisted it was just a shadow, an odd trick of the light. Others weren't so sure. No other photo in the envelope, no explanation, just that single image, eerie in its silence. Days later, investigators brought in a forensic team to thoroughly comb through room 3B. The carpet had to be peeled back. Underneath, they discovered faint chalk markings, symbols, circles, something almost ritualistic. One section was heavily scuffed, as if someone had paced in tight circles over and over. On the inside of the closet door, written in shaky black marker, they found words etched repeatedly. He waits in the quiet. He doesn't knock. Forensics lifted a partial set of fingerprints from the closet door. The match came back within a day, Daniel Price. That should have been the breakthrough, the moment where things made sense. But it only made the puzzle darker. When Daniel's sister, Beth Price, was shown the photo, she broke down. Not because of his face, but because of something only she noticed. Daniel wore a necklace in the picture, a thin leather cord with a small brass pendant. It wasn't something he ever wore before he vanished. But it was identical to one he had given to their younger brother, Eric, who had died from a heart condition 2 years after Daniel disappeared. There was no way Daniel could have known about the necklace. Unless he'd returned. Unless he'd been watching. That same week, local police retrieved storage records from the Blue Pine Motel. Buried deep in a handwritten ledger from 5 years earlier, room 3B had been checked out, under a false name, John Harker. But the ID provided was real. A Massachusetts driver's license belonging to a man who had died in 2014. It was never reported stolen. Detectives began reviewing surrounding security footage, but almost all tapes from the last 6 years had been overwritten or corrupted. All except for one, a single clip from the motel's hallway camera, dated exactly 3 years prior to the room's discovery. At 3:08 a.m., a figure appears just outside room 3B. Tall, still, wearing dark clothing, the person stands motionless for 6 hours straight. No blinking, no shifting, just standing, as if waiting. Then, at 9:12 a.m., the video glitches, and when it recovers seconds later, the hallway is empty. No exit recorded. No other movement detected. The hallway lights never flicker, the doors never open. It's as if the figure simply vanished. Technicians reviewed the video dozens of times. Some said the figure looked like Daniel. Others weren't convinced. The resolution was too grainy. But one detail chilled the entire team. In the 6-hour video, not once did the figure cast a shadow. And then came the motel employee's statement, a cleaning woman who had been working at the Blue Pine on and off for years. Quiet, soft-spoken, rarely noticed. She told police something no one had heard before. Room 3B, she said, had always given her a bad feeling. Once, when delivering towels before it was shut down, she thought she heard whispering from inside, except the room had no guests checked in. And the whispering didn't sound like one voice, but two, overlapping, like echoes out of sync. She left the towels on the floor and never went near the room again. It was now beyond a missing persons case. Something had changed. The hollow oak had been the beginning, but whatever this was, whatever followed, had never really stopped. And now it was moving again. Only one question remained. Was Daniel still alive, or had something else taken his place? The contents of room 3B had already unnerved the investigation team, but it was what they found hidden above the ceiling tiles that shattered any illusion that this was a normal missing persons case. As the forensic crew worked through the room inch by inch, one officer noticed a warped section of the drop ceiling just above the bed. He pushed upward and a square tile slid aside, revealing a narrow crawlspace between the ceiling and the roof. Inside, cloaked in dust and spiderwebs, was a thin leather-bound journal wrapped in a decayed pillowcase. The pages were damp and partially stuck together, but the handwriting, cramped, desperate, and unmistakably human, was still legible. It was Daniel's. The first entry was dated August 12, 2018, over 2 years after his disappearance. He didn't write like someone on the run. He wrote like someone hiding. Not from people, but from something else. Greater than, I woke up here again. I don't remember how. I was in the woods, or maybe in the road. The mirror's back. Same room. Same door. Locked again. Always locked again. Over the following entries, Daniel described being trapped in room 3B, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. He noted times where he'd fall asleep in one place, a bus stop, a storage shed, once even a hospital hallway, and wake up back in this motel room. Always alone. Always with the mirror. And always at 3:33 a.m. Greater than, I never hear it come. But I feel it. Right before the lights go out. Like pressure behind my eyes. It's not in the room. It's in the mirror. I think it uses the mirror. Greater than, I tried to cover it once. Woke up with my hands bleeding. The sheet was gone. The mirror was clean again. The entries grew more erratic, more paranoid, filled with scratched out phrases and drawn symbols, circles, eyes, jagged spirals. Sometimes Daniel seemed lucid. Other times he rambled about the split place, a phrase that came up repeatedly but without context. A possible location, a hallucination. He wrote about something he called the still man, a figure that never moved but was always closer the next time he looked. One particularly disturbing passage was dated March 4, 2019. Greater than, it wore my face last night. Sat across from me and smiled with teeth that weren't mine. It spoke in my voice. Said it had been practicing. As investigators read through the journal, the room seemed to close in with every line. But the final entry was what truly changed everything. Greater than, there's no way out. But there might be a trade. If this is found, and someone remembers me, it will know. It's always listening. But maybe if it takes you, it will finally let me go. The entry was dated just 6 weeks before the room was rediscovered. And it ended with a drawing. 2 stick figures. One with a smile. One with hollow eyes. An arrow between them, pointing in both directions. That night, one of the officers who handled the journal reported strange interference on his phone. Texts he didn't send, static in the earpiece, voices that didn't belong on voicemails. His dog refused to enter his bedroom. The next morning, his bathroom mirror had a single word etched into the condensation: trade. The team began referring to the journal not as evidence, but as a warning. And slowly, unspoken among them all, a fear began to grow. What if Daniel wasn't missing? What if Daniel was still in room 3B? Just not on this side anymore. By the time the final forensic sweep concluded, room 3B had become more than a crime scene. It was something no one wanted to name out loud. The journal, the photo, the license, the mirror, it all pointed to a place where reality had buckled, just slightly, around the edges. But if that room was the center of something strange, something invasive, then what came next only confirmed how deep the damage truly went. It started with a glitch. A technician assigned to catalog all the items from room 3B reported a malfunction in the evidence lab's secure drive. Only one file had been affected, the photograph of Daniel Price. The image didn't corrupt in the usual way. Instead, the file reverted. The original image, Daniel standing in front of the mirror, had changed. The figure behind him was now gone. In its place was just space. Empty. Silent. The mirror now reflected only Daniel. But Daniel's face had changed too. His expression, once desperate and wide-eyed, now showed the faintest smile. Barely perceptible, but it was there. His posture was straighter. His eyes less panicked. Something had shifted, not in the file format, but in the image itself, as though the subject inside it had moved, and wanted someone to know. Then came the calls. Over the course of a week, 3 separate former employees of the Hollow Oak reported strange occurrences. One man, the old cook, said he'd started dreaming about the pub again, specifically the back alley where Daniel vanished. He described waking up in a cold sweat each night at exactly 3:33 a.m., always hearing the sound of a door creaking open. The second, a waitress, claimed she'd found her old pub apron hanging in her garage, still damp, even though it had been packed away for years. She didn't remember unpacking it. She didn't even remember keeping it. The third, Alan Prentice, the former owner, never gave a statement. He was found dead in his apartment 2 days later, the victim of an apparent heart attack. His answering machine was still blinking when police entered his unit. The final voicemail was static at first, then a brief, garbled whisper. "He's watching again." The trade worked. That same day, Beth Price received a manila envelope at her workplace. No return address. Inside was a photograph, not the original image from room 3B, but a new one. Daniel, once again, in front of a mirror. Only this time, the mirror was cracked. His hand rested against it, and behind him, the room wasn't the motel. It was a bar, a familiar one, wood-paneled walls, worn leather stools, a framed photo of a deer head above the counter. She'd been there before, everyone had. It was the Hollow Oak. The details were exact, but the mirror showed no camera flash, no photographer, no figure behind him, only Daniel, alone, and smiling. That image sent the case spiraling again. Investigators returned to the remains of the pub, now partially collapsed and reclaimed by nature. What they found under the floorboards of the back alley defied any logical explanation. Charred wood panels warped into the shape of a spiral, beneath which was a perfectly preserved section of concrete, with the imprint of 2 bare feet pressed into the center. One set, facing out. Authorities closed off the area. The case was sealed again, this time with restrictions so tight that even junior officers weren't allowed to access the files. No press release was given. No updates were shared. Beth moved away shortly after. No forwarding address. In room 3B, it no longer exists. The Blue Pine Motel was bulldozed the next week. But if you ask anyone from that town, they'll tell you this much. The mirror in the Hollow Oak may be gone, the room long erased, but every once in a while, usually in the early hours of the morning, a certain kind of silence still falls over the woods nearby. Heavy, watching, as if someone, or something, is still trying to find its way back. And maybe it already has.